Today we will hear a review of Lost Children Archive by Valeria Luiselli, which Vanity Fair says, this book about a husband and wife on a journey to the Mexican border with their kids is many things at once. An epic road trip through a vanished America, the story of one family's quiet dissolution, and a meditation on displacement and deportation. Our presenter today is Dr. Grania Marcus, immigrant rights advocate and founding member of the Rochester Rapid Response Network and the Rochester Green Light Allies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Marcus to the podium. Thank you.
Good morning. I want to thank Susan for inviting me to do this. It actually forced me outside my usual reading scope by making me read a novel. And that is true confessions, not something I usually do. While I really appreciate the opportunity to do this and to stretch my experience. Just so you know, she mentioned that I've been an immigration activist, and since I retired a few years ago, I have been doing that full time. I want to begin with, let me just do my little clicker here. So you can, why is the, okay, where is the, The clicker is not doing what it's supposed to be doing. So I'm kind of wondering, okay, wrong direction. Okay. That's the title page. You'll have to forgive me for a lot of text on these slides, which I'll also supplement. I will say that reading this novel, Lost Children Archive, was a challenge for me. I am not a person who reads fiction almost at all, and especially in the last 15, 20 years. So you will have to bear with me. So this is the book that we're reviewing, and she began the novel in 2014. And the key thing about this time period was it was the time during the Obama administration when the first so-called surge of child migrants from Central America, primarily from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, were coming in great numbers to the U.S. and fleeing their countries of origin. So she decided at that time, she had been working on, in New York City, she had been working as an interpreter for children who, in order to pursue their asylum claims, had to fill out a 40-question questionnaire, and that's the book, Tell Me How It Ends. If you have any trouble hearing me, I have a habit of sort of moving around, so let me know. Tell Me How It Ends is an essay. It's very different from Lost Children Archive, and I ended up reading them together. And the reason for that was the book is a more factual as opposed to lyrical and fantasy and some of the other writing, literary methods that come into play in Lost Children Archive. And I was just yearning for the factual information. And so I ended up reading the two of them together. And while this will be primarily a review of Lost Children Archive, I want to mention that as well. Tell Me How It Ends is an indictment of U.S. treatment of more than 102,000 undocumented children fleeing horrific poverty and violence in their homelands, in their native countries. And there's a piece of that which I feel that all Americans need to know about, which is that the reason for much of the violence that has happened in these countries with the huge death rates stems from U.S. interventions in those countries from the 1950s through the present. And so I'll just mention a couple of things, and we don't have time to go into what those are. But overthrowing the democratically elected leader of Guatemala in 1954, Guatemalan civil war and genocides that resulted, civil war in El Salvador, torture and genocide there in El Salvador, and deportation of Salvadoran gang members from Los Angeles in the 1990s under the Clinton administration, CAFTA, which is the Central American Free Trade Agreement, which drove many people into poverty and off their lands as farmers, and then the Honduran coup in 2009, which the Democrats were, I hate to say this, but were very much involved in, especially Hillary Clinton. So the point of view she has in this book is that responsibility is not just the problem of those countries. Responsibility heavily falls on our own country, as well as some other things. So just so briefly, am I going the wrong way? Yes. So why did I read both together? Because they were actually written concurrently. She started one, and then she started writing Tell Me How It Ends, and then she went back to Lost Children Archive. And so Lost Children Archive was published right after, 2 years after Tell Me How It Ends. And then the third thing is she discusses in there her own experience as an immigrant. Again, not in a huge amount of detail, but in enough, and for example, the fact that she and her husband both had to were applying for green cards, which are permanent residence cards, which allows you to work in the U.S. and to live here, quote, legally. So she did not receive her green card, which meant she had to right away. She eventually gets it, but it impacted her schedule and her time and her family's life. So she talks about the precariousness of life and uncertainty as an immigrant. And with that, she, even though her situation is extremely different, she was very, it attuned her to the work she was doing as an interpreter. Did I go the wrong way again? Yes, I did. So this is more about why I found it really beneficial to read both books together, not, one like that, but one after the other, because I really feel that they complement each other. And so for the reader, I found it really helpful in understanding both. The author, Valeria Luis Ali, she's actually her parents' families were Italian immigrants to Mexico, but she is a Mexican citizen and was born in Mexico. Her father, was a diplomat, so she had a quite privileged upbringing. She lived really all over the world, including South Africa, South Korea, India, and the U.S. Both of these books are written in English, not in Spanish, even though Spanish is her first language. And she's completely, totally, extremely literate, to say the least, in English. So they're not translations, they are actually written in the language. And it's kind of interesting, the contrast between her very privileged and highly educated, she has a PhD from Columbia University, background, and the children of poverty and violence that she's writing about. So as Susan said, it's a very complex, many-layered story, Lost Children Archive. It is kind of on the surface about a road trip that both she and her husband and their 2 children take to Cochise County, Arizona, across from which I lived for 3 years. And so I'm very familiar with the area and a lot of work with Mexican organizations as well as U.S. organizations. However, in the book, there's way less about that. The book is much more, on one level, a story that's really just touched on in sort of feeling writing of her experience of the dissolution of her marriage during that trip and shortly thereafter, and in which it wasn't just the dissolution of her marriage, but also the dissolution of her family, because her children, the oldest one, was a 10-year-old boy who was the child of the father from a previous marriage. The girl, referred to in the book as the girl, nobody has names in this book, the boy, the girl. The girl was the child of that marriage. So they were half sister, half brother and sister. So when they separate, and I'm kind of giving you a little preview, which you really don't get until the very end of the book, do you understand that they are breaking up their family. It really is a family separations that is plural, because it's not just the husband and wife, but the 2 children lose each other too. They go on this road trip, and this is another layer in the book, for the reason that she wants to pursue her project of documenting the migrant children and their stories. She wants to pursue it on the border. As I think I explained, she can't work any longer as an interpreter in a legal setting because she doesn't receive her green card. So she decides to do this project. she's referred to in the book as the mother, mama, never by her name. So it seems very abstract in many ways. And then, and at the same time, so there's just a lot of use of the term lost. And lost means, as I'll explain, many different things. Then the husband's project at the same time is that he's interested in what he refers to as Apacheria, which is the borderlands where the Apaches lived, and his project is to kind of to find out what happened. Why were the Apaches lost? And he's particularly interested in Geronimo, who was, I believe, died in the 1880s. So I could be wrong about the exact date, but so they have these two very separate projects, and and one of the things that's sort of a theme in the book is how they talk about these projects, but you almost never see actually doing the projects. So it's kind of, I kept waiting for, I wanted to find out more from the children, and that didn't happen, at least not the way as a historian, I would have wanted to see it happen. So, but I'm going to try to fix this so I can read it. And the thing about the dissolution of the marriage, again, is just kind of hinted at all through the book of like her, how they seem to be growing apart and stuff, but it's almost like it is interior dialogue. You never see the two of them discussing together, well, what are we going to do about our marriage? And so you don't find out until the very end of the book in part 2, which is the narration. Part 2 is the narration of the boy, and part 1 is the narration of Ma. So they're two very different narrators, very different subjects, and the boy really wrestles with his relationship with his sister in part 2. And I actually, even though it employs this literary, I don't know what you'd call it, but sort of literary mechanic, I guess, I don't know, of having his narrative is clearly fiction. It's about he and his sister getting lost. And the way I found this by far the most affecting part of the book which was how he cared for his sister in this extremely inhospitable climate while they were lost. And at the end, he talks about this made me cry. It'll probably make me cry again, but what the impact of the separation will be, and he actually prepares for it in a lot of ways. And so I found that, as you can see, I found that really compelling. And I have to say I was surprised by that, because it was difficult to, throughout the book, you don't get really much emotion. She talks about emotions in a very sanitized, abstract way. And while she has these really compelling phrases and paragraphs that she writes, she's an amazing writer, you don't really warm up to her. And whereas the boy is as I say, in the second part. So it's very different, the two parts of it. I think I've talked about this, so I'm just going to read it, let you read it quickly. All right, I'm going the wrong. The arrows are kind of the opposite of what the arrows seem to be, so this is why I'm confused. The theme of Lost is real. I hope you can see this screen. Turn the light off because it's better. It make it easier to read. Is that true? Yes. Yeah. Okay. So if you had trouble reading the previous one, let me start there. Okay? Yeah. Okay. And it's basically what I said. So now we sort of get to the heart of, you're wondering probably what's lost children, and I've sort of touched on that. But there are just many layers of how she approaches writing about lostness. And they're really some very different things. And the most obvious the most obvious is the lost children. And that's because these children that flee their countries, many of them are what is called by the Border Patrol unaccompanied minors. And the reason for that is because their families can't go with them in many cases. Not always, especially now, you're seeing more families. But in 2014 and 15, that was more children, their parents pay a coyote, which is like a guide through the journey. It's a 2,000-mile journey from Guatemala, El Salvador. They travel on something called La Bestia, which is the freight trains that travel north in Mexico. And when I say travel, I don't mean to get a ticket and a seat. They literally cling to the top of La Bestia, which means the beast. And many of them fall off. Many of them die. These are children. Some of them are what we would call teenagers, but many are, elementary age, like I'm sure some of your grandchildren and mine. So it's just a horrific thing. Again, she doesn't go into a lot of detail. She kind of touches on it. But she does describe La Bestia in considerable detail. So that's one. And then lost, they also die in the desert in both Mexico and the U.S. They die in Mexico because of gang violence. And she gives some very statistics that are just completely astounding, which is like 120,000 migrants died through violence in Mexico. So, and this is just an aside, but so that means that For example, under Trump, this so-called Remain in Mexico program is really a horror show. And so I can't say more about that because I don't have time, but if you have questions, I'd be happy to talk with you. So that's the issue. That's another kind of lostness. The children are lost, they're traumatized. Then there's also the lostness of her relationship and the family, even though I say you don't really know that that happens, and you don't get a detailed picture of it. It's almost like kind of touching down and then pulling away and touching down and pulling away. So, and then in part 2, the brother and sister get lost, and the quote that really stuck out to me from the boy is, I wanted to remind her that even though those children were lost, referring to the migrant children, we were not lost. We were there, right there next to her. And it made me wonder, what if we got lost? Would she then finally pay attention to us? So the brother and sister run away. And part 2 is about that fantasy voyage of running away and not, and running into all kinds of hardships of one kind or another. So I find the character of the boy the most, as I said, the most appealing person. And while you get a picture of it's a well-delineated character of the mom, the pa, not so much. He's more like kind of just an outline of a person. Except when he talks about the Indians and the Apaches in particular. Am I going backwards again? Oh, no. Yeah, this thing. Okay, and the lostness also refers to, she has a friend, Manuela, who she meets during her interpreting work in New York. And Manuela has 2 older daughters. She's been in the United States a really long time, like almost a decade. Also pretty typical for a lot of undocumented folks. But she had left her 2 very young daughters in Guatemala with their grandma. Eventually, she has enough money that she can send for them. She can pay the coyote, which is generally thousands of dollars. It's extremely expensive. So the 2 girls who were elementary age but not little kids, they make their way to the border and they get detained. This, again, is really touched on in different parts of the book, but not in a huge amount of detail. And then Manuela, who's in New York, she asked Valeria if she could translate their documents for them. And she does, and so she gets more interested in what happens to these girls. So the last they hear is that they're in detention, but they can't figure out where they are. Also, I must say, very typical. It's very, there are ways to do it, but it's very difficult to locate people sometimes in detention. So that's part of Valeria's motivation for going to the border, is to try to find these two girls. And the really sad thing, in the very end, at the end of part 2, you find out that the girls' body skeletons are found in the desert in Arizona. And again, people dying in the desert is very typical. So I think overall the book is really about the fragility of life and the difficulties of the fragility, the fact that you think you have a trajectory in life or a plan and nothing, and it generally doesn't work out that way for a variety of reasons. I think we all know this. But it's also about the lostness of the children. The more lyrical and abstract, I'll read it from here because it's easier. The abstract sort of meditations that the author, part 1 narrative, contain a detailed scaffolding, which is these boxes that she and her husband and the kids, like banker boxes or, file boxes, basically take with them. And they're filled with all kinds of things, everything from maps to reports, to her research, to his research, to kids' stuff. Those are actually detailed in the book. Like you see the lists of what's in these books. Did I go backwards again? Yes. So to finish, the book is really beautifully written, amazingly written, and you get sentences and paragraphs that just make you say, yes, you get like a light bulb going on. And it's mostly autobiographical, actually in both sections, even though the second section is written is the fantasy of the boy. It still very closely follows what they are actually doing. The characters of the author and the two children are you really understand what they are about. So they're, they kind of come alive in a way. The character of the father, not so much. And, but I will say I found the novel's sort of chopped up structure, and some sections are like that long, and some sections are, pages and pages and pages, and interspersed with all these literary references and allusions, A-L-L. And so I found that kind of tough going. And those of you who are novel lovers might not find it as tough going. So I don't want you to get discouraged by that. And I found, you can read this, but I found that her obvious privilege and the tremendous education she received as a result of that privilege is never really acknowledged. So it seems a little like very distant, like she seems 180 degrees from the lost children that she's talking about. And this is just a quote from the book, which you can read because it really did kind of speak to me. some other quote might speak to others of you. I found this. Now, this is the kind of sort of lights that she puts in the whole novel. So it's definitely worth reading, but it's not an easy read. Okay. And I think, yes. All right, let me leave that up, though.